In this lesson, we'll try to answer the question, where did mitochondria come from? Now, in previous lessons, we've used this cartoon of an amoeba to illustrate some of the key processes in the chemistry of life. So let's recap quickly some of the things that we've learned. Over here on the right, we see the amoeba is detecting and pursuing and capturing its food, its prey, so that's paramecium there. And so we have pseudopods that are being extended to surround the prey, and these two will join, and that'll form a food vacuole, as we see on the left here. Inside the food vacuole, digestive proteins will begin to chop up the paramecium into a bunch of nutrient molecules. So here we see the A, G, C's, and T's, the bases, the nucleic acids found in DNA of the paramecium, will be repurposed to build amoeba DNA. Should the amoeba go on to reproduce, it'll have to duplicate its DNA, and it'll use those spare bases to do so. The proteins of the paramecium will be broken down into the individual amino acids, so there are 20 different kinds of amino acids, and now the amoeba then has some building supplies to build its own proteins. The membrane of the paramecium, those lipid molecules, can be used to build more amoeba membrane as the amoeba grows. And finally, let's see what happens to the sugars. So here's glucose. We've learned that a team of proteins will begin to break glucose down, breaking those chemical bonds, and that releases energy. But in complex cells like this, the final breakdown of glucose occurs in a structure called the mitochondria. And mitochondria then are responsible for transferring the energy of glucose into molecules of ATP. So if glucose has $36 worth of energy all wrapped up in those chemical bonds, ATP molecules have $1 worth of energy, just the right amount of energy needed by the thousands of different kinds of proteins that are doing the chemistry of life in the cell. This particular protein, its job was to make a chemical bond between the green and the red molecule, and to do that job, it needs energy in the form of ATP. So the question for this lesson then will be, well, where did these mitochondria come from? Now you'll recall simple cells like a bacterium here, they don't have mitochondria. Well, how do they make ATP? Well, the bank proteins are just in the membrane of the cell. For complex cells, those bank proteins are in the mitochondria. So the mitochondria are the power plants of large complex cells. It's the mitochondria that produce the ATP that fuels the chemistry of life. So let's get to this question now. Where did mitochondria come from? Do cells make them from scratch? Does every complex cell just have the information somehow to build their own power plants, to build mitochondria? Or did they perhaps evolve by natural selection in some kind of way? Well, we're going to look at 3 clues to the identity and origin of mitochondria. Clue number 1 is mitochondria are similar size to bacteria. So we noted that bacteria couldn't possibly have mitochondria because they're roughly the same size as mitochondria. And bacteria don't need mitochondria. They make ATP using the bank proteins in the cell membrane. The second clue, surprisingly, is mitochondria have DNA. Now, on the left here, we see bacteria cell. Recall it has a circular chromosome, circular molecule of DNA. Well, it turns out mitochondria also have circular DNA. Clue number 3 is that mitochondria reproduce like bacteria. So on the left here, we see a picture of a bacterium that is going through cell division. So it was growing bigger and bigger, in this case longer and longer, like that cell up there. But remember, bacteria have a problem. As they grow, the volume grows faster than the surface area. Their energy needs will grow faster than their ability to produce ATP. So they will face an energy shortage. And the way they get around that is they divide to stay small. So here we see the bacteria dividing here. So prior to cell division, it had to duplicate its DNA, and then it just divides. Well, it turns out mitochondria also reproduce like bacteria inside the larger cell. So these are really fascinating structures. Mitochondria are power plants that reproduce. So when one cell divides into 2 cells, so here we see an amoeba going through cell division, the mitochondria are divided up as well. And this explains how mitochondria can be present in both daughter cells. So the original parent amoeba had lots of mitochondria as those mitochondria reproduced in the larger parent cell. And then when the amoeba went through cell division, some of the mitochondria ended up in one daughter, some of the mitochondria ended up in another daughter. But if mitochondria make new mitochondria inside a cell, how did they get into the ancestor cell in the first place? So the puzzle here is, how did they get into the cell? It's one thing to understand that mitochondria can reproduce. This is how they can be transferred to daughter cells, but how did they get into the first cell, the ancestor cell? Our three clues are going to provide an answer. Again, mitochondria are the size of bacteria, have circular DNA like bacteria, and reproduce like bacteria. And so the suggestion is that mitochondria were once free-living bacteria that somehow got themselves inside of another larger cell. This idea is today known as endosymbiosis theory. It's the idea that long ago, roughly 2 billion years ago, two cells joined to make one more complicated cell. And that was a beneficial arrangement for both parties. And the event that happened some 2 billion years ago would be the origin of today's mitochondria. So mitochondria today can trace their history back to free-living bacteria that at one stage, some 2 billion years ago, got themselves inside of another larger cell and struck up this cooperative arrangement that we see in all complex cells today.